This is Oral Rehab Lecture 5, Part 2. I again organized the slide set so that the first slide in this slide set, this one actually, is slide 7, which was the slide I had left off on, so that the numbering system in your slide set aligns with the numbering system that you see at the bottom of these slides. I left off at the end of the last screencast simply talking about the perils of examiner bias. In the notion of psychosocial assessment, some of these measures that are used, particularly in terms of assessment of a child's social adequacy, social capacities, are highly subjective, based on sort of the skills, expertise, but also on other aspects that are part of the examiner. And we'll think that the examiner is primarily going to be sort of a school psychologist type of person. So given that, one would think that that they're trained well and that they're trained without bias and that they do their jobs without bias. But from my perspective, I think that it's good for us to consider that we need to, as non-psychologist advocates for children, to sort of be aware of it. So the general issue here I'm talking about is sort of like in terms of child's socialization and social status, that the examiner can be highly projective, meaning not necessarily see something there. The behavior in the child may not necessarily support the person's conclusions, but yet that's their opinion nonetheless. I'll refer to that as a sort of examiner bias. And sort of here's a way to kind of think about it. If you're skeptical on the point, that's good. But let me throw this by you here just to kind of see what you think. Now, this notion of examiner bias was raised not so much by me, although I am with you right now, but was raised by a guy named Harlan Lane. Harlan Lane is a hearing person, but he's a linguist, a psychologist. Mostly spent his career at Northeastern University in the Boston area. He wrote several books in between tying together the deaf community and deafness, and so he's been kind of a hero, I would think, of the deaf community, even though he's a hearing person. And one book that he wrote was called The Mask of Benevolence. And in it, he made sort of it's a very interesting point, to me anyways, interesting. He had a generalized thesis in this, or generalized contention, which is to say, and just have to kind of stay with me on this, okay? What do the native peoples of colonial Africa, meaning the 1700s to the 1800s, have in common with the deaf, small d, capital D, deaf of the 20th century? So you might think, well, what possible connection could there be between the native peoples of colonial Africa and the deaf of the 20th century? Well, what Lane did was, I don't know, you might consider it to be outrageous. I think it's sort of clever and interesting. Is that Lane went back to the literature of the colonists, so what he referred to as the literature of colonialism. So he went to the literature from the 17, 18, 1900s, whatever, that time period, and read what essentially the Europeans, remember that Africa had been colonized by people from Holland and Belgium and France and England and other countries, Spain, Portugal. So to a certain extent looked at, so it was mostly European literature. And he looked in their literature, whatever, I don't have at my fingertips what the operational definition of literature was, but writings by the colonists of the native peoples. And he broke their descriptions down, again, things attributed to the natives, the African people, whatever they were at that time, and broke them down into four sort of general categories: social adjectives, cognitive adjectives, behavioral, and emotional. Now, a couple things as we look through this list. Number one, there are some inconsistencies, and I think that's okay. You just have to kind of that's not a problem, But for the most part, most of these words are not positive words, for lack of a better expression. Again, there's some inconsistencies. Like here's one that says they're both ignorant and they're intelligent. They're intelligent and they're irrational. So things that don't really sort of, that they're, ignorant, but they're cunning. So there's things that are certainly not always consistent. But the point is, most of these adjectives applied by the colonists to the natives are generally said are negative in nature. Now, is it possible that the native peoples of Africa in the 1700s through whatever were represented by all of these adjectives? Is this a description of all of these people? And I think I would say no. Okay, but what Lane's point is that the colonists, in their self-determined role of sort of conqueror, colonist, of imperialist, of the conquering people, this is how they viewed their subjects. This is how they viewed people who they wanted to see were their inferiors. Then what Lane did was he turned around and then looked at the literature of the 20th century in the professional literature, so things that would have been published, peer-reviewed journals in the professional literature, mostly in sort of education and special education, to a certain extent in psychology, to look at what professionals, and these could be speech pathologists, audiologists, psychologists, sociologists, educators, what were the adjectives that professionals in professional literature described the deaf as? And again, to a certain extent, this was part of a collective sense of, well, what's the psychology of the deaf? And again, this is something that, as I said to you before, I have to sort of reject, because it was based on this kind of literature here. So if we look at the psychology of the deaf, if we look at traits attributed to deaf people by professionals in the 20th century, so literature that he looked at was in the 20th century, you're going to see, again, using the same four categories, social, cognitive, behavioral, and emotional, you're going to see words that generally said are not totally positive sets of adjectives. Under the cognitive, unintelligent, no language, language poor, mechanically inept, other things. I mean, you pick what you want. This is a list of words that is, almost horrible to look at. And you might think, wow, is that really true? So if you looked at, or the literature, or if you looked at even textbooks from the 1950s and 60s and even maybe the 1970s that attempted to describe or were titled Psychology of the Deaf, you'd get your sensation of that population would be sort of likely featured by these kinds of descriptors. So is there a point you're probably asking at this time? Well, yeah, and here's the point that Lane is making, which is to say, here are the traits attributed to the Africans, here's the traits by the colonists, here's the traits attributed to the deaf by the professionals. If you look at these two lists, they're incredibly similar. They're similar relative to intent, and there might be even some words that are on both. So, the notion of unintelligent is on both. The idea of this impulsivity is on both. You can go through and find your own sets of comparisons. But the point is that both of these sets of adjectives are really sort of highly subjective. And when you consider who's making them, Lane's point was that the people making the sets of descriptors were people who were, if you will, and this is, again, Lane's point, were like the superiors, the conquerors, the imperialists, the colonists, and they had to use words like this in order to make themselves, sort of feel better or be better than their subjects. The indictment that he makes, actually, that he raises, Lane actually came up with a word that he called audism, analogous to racism. This is that there is a bias based on sort of the hearing world and hearing personnels, because again, most of the professionals that were doing this literature were hearing people, that the deaf that they worked with, that they had this sort of sense of superiority to, and they have this notion of audism, like racism or sexism, that ageism, that kind of stuff. That this is a generalized sort of discrimination and sort of mindset that's opposed to people simply because they can't hear. Now, that's a pretty strident kind of claim. And I don't know that I would go all the way with him. I have a lot of respect for Harlan Lane. But I think when you compare and contrast these two tables again of adjectives, I think you should notice, as I did, a correspondence, and if you would accept his contention that these lists of descriptors is highly subjective and projected by the persons doing the writing, and again, in this case, an attempt to sort of subjugate the people, whether it's the Africans over in the colonist view or deaf people based on the professionals. So it's a striking kind of indictment that, why would persons who are intending to help people, why would they in fact have such a negative view of the people they work with? And Lane's just sort of general answer is that, well, they have to they do this to sort of make themselves feel superior. And in fact, an even more striking contention that he makes is that maybe people that go into special education have a psychological need to be filled, to feel better than others. So they're put themselves around persons who are significantly challenged so that they feel better about themselves. That's pretty striking. That's pretty hardcore, but certainly, and if you get a visceral and an emotional reaction to that kind of contention, I think that's good for you to have that as a consideration. We don't have to necessarily go with it all the way, but I think it's quite an interesting comparison. And again, the point of this was this underscores a caution in psychosocial assessment of a child with hearing loss or of the deaf, because some of their measures might be more predicated on their bias potentially than not. Okay, with that, we're going to move to talk about psychosocial consequences in adults, and that'll be in slide set, or rather in screen cast 3.